Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Hello. Welcome to the Green College Resident Members Series. I'll begin by acknowledging that UBC Green College is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. For those new or watching the recording, the Green College Resident Members Series is a weekly public lecture series in which resident members of UBC's Green College, so graduate students and postdocs, present on topics related to their research or their field of study or interest. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Erika Siao is a queer multiracial settler and MA student at UBC Geography. Having grown up across the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Beijing, they are a walking body of cultural influences that don't seem to make sense together. I'm reading out what she provided.
Michael, you can tell them this one thing.
With a background in community organizing, their current research centers on community-based responses to climate change and queer conceptions of climate justice. Her other interests include long conversations, large bodies of water, writing creative nonfiction, and the sun. So please join me in welcoming Erika.
Thank you. I was not aware that the bio would be read out loud. Thank you for that riveting introduction. Hello, I'm Erika. For those of you who don't know me, I'm excited to talk with you today about my bachelor's thesis. So I wanted to start by just echoing Michael's land acknowledgement that we are seated today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I believe that all the work here in the university should be contextualized by this fact, and especially in the social sciences, and especially when we're speaking about global power relations, which I am going to be doing today. We need to situate ourselves in an anti-colonial context. And also, I think this goes without saying, but it's important to say it, that these power relations have concrete and often disastrous effects on indigenous people around the world, from Turtle Island to Palestine. And if you haven't already, I would encourage people to go check out the Solidarity encampment here on campus. I'm not one of the main organizers, but would be happy to connect you or answer any questions about it if folks are curious. So who am I? As my bio illustrated or began to speak to, I have grown up all my life kind of between worlds. The main two worlds are California and Beijing, China. It's important for me to tell you this because this research that I'm talking about today is situated in Beijing, which is one of my homes and where my whole family is from. The largest chunk of time I spent there was as a middle schooler from 4th grade to 8th grade, and when I was there, I went to international school. So I was kind of not fully integrated with the society, and because I'm mixed race, even though I speak fluent Mandarin and my parents both grew up in China, I'm often seen kind of as an outsider there as well, which I think was one of the points that I was able to relate to my research respondents on this topic. I studied political economy at UC Berkeley for my BA. My undergrad advisor was a geographer, and I think that this thesis is actually a pretty geography project, which is what I do now. Currently, my research has very little to do with this, but I would say the linkage between what I'm doing now and what I was doing back then was something along the lines of unpacking these larger geopolitical terms via pretty concrete conversations with people, and with an emphasis on how communities respond to state policies and these larger structures, and kind of centering the community voice in that. So right now I'm focusing on urban climate justice from a queer perspective. In case you didn't know, I'm queer. Shocking. But this isn't going to be about that. This is going to be about my bachelor's thesis, and I'm about to head into my MA fieldwork, so it's exciting to kind of go back to this project and think about kind of the takeaways from there before I embark on a different stage of the research journey. So this was my research question, and it changed a lot throughout the time of my thesis development. But here we have it, is how has Chinese soft power manifested in spaces of Africa-China educational cooperation, and to what extent has it been successful? And some important context to give before I go into a little bit more of the introduction behind this question is that all of this research and thinking happened prior to COVID. So things look very different now when it comes to especially like international and migrant communities in China, and a project like this would not be possible today. So that's just kind of to situate us in the time period, even though it was just a few years ago. Big drastic changes in policy over the last few years. Okay, a bit of an introduction. So I was motivated to start this project by an event that I went to in Beijing when I visited in 2018, which was called African Storytelling Night. And this really struck me as an event title because when I grew up there, back in the early to late 2000s, there were very few African students or African people in Beijing or in China more broadly, and that was pretty evident in the makeup of my international school and the spaces that I occupied. The Bookworm is like one of the hubs of kind of like literary discussion. There were events, and they had like salsa dancing, and it was a bookstore, it was a cafe. So lots of different things. It was like a gathering point for the international community. I was pretty surprised that this was an event they were putting on. I went there and I saw like a room full of African people kind of sharing their culture and their stories. And I was very inspired by that and also just curious like what had led to this more recent migration pattern. So that led me to do a little bit of work on Chinese relations with a few different African nations, including Ethiopia and Zambia. At the same time, I was thinking a lot about development, so my concentration in my undergrad was in global development, and quickly learned how problematic most global developments have been throughout the years. And I was intrigued by this idea that China could offer some other path towards quote-unquote development that wasn't only black and white as like neo-colonial or only decolonial, but it was somewhere kind of not quite fitting with the models that we'd come to think about development and colonialism that was set, predominantly by the British. And also was just curious about how China, as one of my homes, had been, spoken about in the news, and various human rights violations and things that had happened over the course of my undergrad period of like 2016 to 2020, and just wanting to zone in on how this particular community experienced some of these concepts. And the observation that I had as a kid and kind of going into this event was actually reflected by the stats as well. So I chose the university as a site because, first of all, of the kind of lineage of Chinese intellectualism that was like centered on the university. It was a place I could access more easily because of like pre-established groups and things like that. And there was actually like a big rise in the number of African students, specifically university students, in the time that I started this research. So just to put this in context, in 2003, there were less than 2,000 African students in China. In 2018, there were over 80,000. So it kind of like exponentially grew, and that was, as you'll see, like not at all an accident. A little bit of a literature review. I won't go like too deeply into this, and I'm sorry that there's a lot of text. The majority of writings on Africa-China relations or China-Africa relations has been more like on the government level, government relations, tracing back to the Mao Zedong era into the Deng Xiaoping era, and different eras in which Chinese leaders and African leaders were united. There was more of like a decolonial and Marxist spin on this, like back in the Mao era, but I think since China has become very neoliberal also in its own way, these relationships have also evolved alongside that. I also drew a lot from writings on soft power. So there are a couple of articles here that I cite here that speak about a unique Chinese form of soft power, which combines material influences with cultural and political influences, and is also related to writings on how Chinese state capital differs from global private capital, and kind of some theories on that. And then a few other bodies of literature I drew on were about migrant communities and the role of education in Chinese society, respectively. And then also there are a variety of authors that have written various case studies on African students in China, but mainly there to highlight a particular group's experiences as opposed to like situating it explicitly in these geopolitical questions. So moving on to my methods, my research would not have been possible without WeChat. WeChat is a masterful, terrifying, all-encompassing like crazy, like could not conceive of how much data is in this app, super app. So I did 3 weeks of fieldwork in Beijing during my last year of undergrad, and I interviewed 30 to 40-ish people, as well as just like followed people around. Mainly used WeChat groups. So at this point, African student communities were kind of thriving. So there were some group chats that I got added to. For example, the Greater Powassa community. Powassa stands for the Peking University African Students Association. And for those who don't know, why would you? Peking University is kind of like the center of Chinese intellectual life. It is like the #1 university in China, and it has also a history of both producing government officials and being like the center of social movements throughout history. And so being part of this group, it wasn't just students there, but also like broader like Beijing intellectual elite kind of vibes. There were over 500 people in this group and a variety of adjacent groups as well. So overall, I interviewed 33 African students and alumni from Chinese universities, and they were from across the African continent. Most of them were studying in Beijing. There were a couple alumni and a couple of folks who studied in other cities and then moved to Beijing, and I did a couple of virtual interviews as well. And in addition to the students, I spoke with some leaders of some key organizations in this space. So Development Reimagined was started by an alumni of the Schwarzman program, which is a very prestigious master's degree in China studies, who is, I don't remember exactly where she was from, but also some Chinese side kind of organizations. So the Confucius Institute is kind of like the leader in Chinese soft power around the world, and they have a headquarters in Beijing, so I spoke to some of them. The Zhongguancun Belt and Road Initiative was like a semi-governmental organization that was responsible for like South-South cooperation is what they call it. And then the universities like Centers for African Studies and professors kind of who are working on this as well. This kind of took me in some pretty interesting directions. I ended up attending a very tech-forward startup awards ceremony where there were drones, and they had it was like a room full of Chinese people with one table of their like international startup section, which was like all Africans, and we were just like sitting there I was just like, where the fuck am I? Sorry. And the church one was really interesting. So Christianity is actually like pretty much banned in China. You have to be a foreigner in order to go to a church. So I followed this one person I interviewed to their church because it was very important to her that I saw this part of her life. And it was just like this dingy like room, not like fancy at all, like just like in like part of a shopping mall. And it was a room full of like hundreds of African people in the audience, and the pastor was like this white Californian dude, and you needed to have a foreign passport in order to go in. And then they started singing, and I was just like, okay, we're in Beijing, like just had to like remember where we were a few times. Which also kind of speaks a little bit to positionality. For me as a Chinese American researcher, I have a lot of family ties and privilege in China, but I'm also, as I kind of spoke to earlier, seen as an outsider in Chinese society and have mostly conducted my social life in pretty similar spaces as these folks among a small but bustling international community. So it was also for me like an opportunity to rediscover places that I would hang out growing up, which is a very particular slice of Beijing. It's a city of 20 million people, so kind of hard to be representative. But at the same time, like the same spaces kept popping up again and again. Like the familiarity kind of grows within this particular bubble. In terms of who I interviewed, I would have loved to be able to be more specific about which African nations people came from, but it was a 3-week like BA project, so I basically spoke to whoever like answered my research call. But I made a chart of the countries and number of people that I spoke to from those countries and compared it to the total number of African students in China, and they're pretty much, like they're not exactly like one-to-one, but they pretty much reflect like the general trend, which kind of makes sense. And in general, I would say like majority folks from East Africa or former British colonies as opposed to French colonies, probably because of language and other like cultural factors. Here is a map of Beijing. So The way that Beijing works is that it's a ring road system. So the pink lines that you see here are the circles, and the very middle is the Forbidden City where the emperor used to live. So I'm roughly highlighting like 2 areas over here. The top left is where the universities are and where it's dubbed as like the Silicon Valley of China, where there's a lot of tech. There's the 2 like major universities that are across the street from one another, Beida and Tsinghua. So PKU, which I've mentioned, and Tsinghua University. And that's also where a lot of the African student community studies, works, and resides. I've also circled over here near the 4th Ring Road. This is kind of like where people hang out, like where young people hang out. So anything like in terms of events, like the one that I mentioned at the Bookworm was happening over here. This is like kind of where I live, and where like the communities that I grew up in are. And so even though like it's a huge city with like the 6 ring roads, pretty much every person that I interviewed suggested that we meet in one of these spheres, if not kind of traversing between them. And they're like maybe an hour and a half away from each other by public transit, but it's interesting kind of to see like the geographic grounding of where these spaces are. It would be like much harder to find foreigner presence in general, like outside of these 2 areas, I would say. They're like pretty concentrated there. It's also where nightlife is concentrated and things like that. Okay, let's go into the findings. I should have said this at the beginning, but if people have questions, you can ask me. Or at the end, whatever. Okay, so I'm organizing my findings by the 3 axes defined by the scholar named Repnikova. The first chapter is about the combination of cultural and market logic in China's approach to soft power via this term that they call pragmatic enticement. The second chapter is about China's alternative development model, so kind of directly speaking to some of the questions I had about Chinese development and neocolonialism and how the students received this kind of propaganda and narrative. And then the third part is about Beijing kind of as a city and as an increasingly globalized city and what that kind of says about China's rising kind of role in the world stage. So first chapter on pragmatic enticement, a couple of interesting quotes. First one, they eat from China, drink from China. Chinese people are so friendly to them. Of course, they'll have a positive impression. In the future, they'll be our friends. And this is from a leader in the Zhongguancun Belt and Road Association who was directly responsible for implementing these kinds of policies. And then the second quote here says, talking big, we say China-Africa cooperation. Talking small, I help you sell stuff. So these quotes to me kind of illustrate the blurring of the economic and the political in Chinese soft power goals. And illustrates kind of that the state uses a combination of cultural and market logic to entice students with Sinocentric viewpoints. Yeah, question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm wondering, what does soft power mean?
That is a great question. So soft, like, when it comes to like geopolitical kind of discussions on like countries' powers, like the hard power is more like militaristic and like directly like conquest based, whereas soft power is more like using things like culture and intellectual life to get people to be like susceptible to that country's narratives or like their way of doing things. So like the Fulbright program in the US is like an example of US soft power to like send people abroad and have them have like positive impressions of the country. Yeah, appreciate the question. So building off of Grace's point, I guess, traditionally we see like soft power as something that is, either like pretty directly economic or more like cultural. But I think the point that the author here was trying to make, that I think my findings kind of reinforce, is that the Chinese model like really blurs the lines between all of these things, and they're not like a clear cut like what is politics, what is economics, etc. And like maybe you could argue that in a lot of cases that's true, but in this case it's like specifically like from the state's perspective that that's the case. So how effective was this? Like, did the students who had come to China to study take away like what the Chinese state wanted them to? So what I found here is that the students that I spoke to actually have pretty complicated political views. And a lot of them did express dissatisfaction with China, but they were also very aware that they couldn't speak about it with me openly because I was a researcher and their findings could be published. So people kind of hinted at, like, they're like, oh, you know, like, what's going on in Hong Kong? But, like, they would not, like, say exactly what it is or what it is that they agree or disagree with. People also hinting towards, like, WeChat surveillance and things like that. And I would say, like, actually, this past summer, I reconnected with some of the folks that I met during interviewing, and after, like, no longer being a researcher, we had more candid conversations about these things, and in fact, they confirmed, like, my suspicion that there was lots that they didn't tell me, which itself is, like, kind of interesting. But regardless of their complex political views, the majority of them do kind of, they have expressed that they've been influenced by Chinese vantage points. So this person, who is a PhD student at PKU, said, in the future when I'm a government employee, because he's, like, on track to be that, because he's, like, from this elite family and, like, already a government official, the first country I'm going to look to is China because I spent a lot of time there. So that's, like, the reference point that they have, regardless of what their exact opinions are. The other thing is that the student entrepreneurs, there's a kind of like a class of people that popped up, which are student entrepreneurs who end up staying. It's very hard to stay after your program, but some people, like, got startup funding to do so, and then they become these bridges between their home countries and China and start organizations such as the one that hosted the storytelling night that I spoke about. And in a way, they kind of become these cultural ambassadors between their home country and China, and in a way kind of strengthening the soft power goals here through these, like, cultural events and also, like, trade networks and things like that that they're facilitating. At the same time, they're kind of flipping the script a little bit. So the organization that hosted this event, named Kenta and Silk, their whole premise was that they felt very misunderstood by Chinese citizens, and so they wanted to host these events to showcase their culture and be able to dispel some myths about African culture. So it's not like a passive process either. That's, like, just fully, like, brainwashed by the state, but taking into account kind of all these experiences. The second part I focus on here is the Chinese state's development model. So the Chinese state emphasizes that they have this alternative to the Washington Consensus, which is, like, the World Bank, IMF, like, US-led kind of style of neoliberal development, which they kind of make clear. They're like, oh, we're not like the colonizers of the West. We're, like, your third world socialist brothers, like, towards these African nations. And some of the features of their model include, like, caring more about economic results than a democratic process, political non-interference, allegedly not totally true, strong state leadership, and this idea of self-sufficiency, so not, like, relying on loans from other nations to develop. And here's a quote from a international politics student, that scholarships are a good opportunity to educate people who would help the development of Africa. So kind of fully directly buying into this idea that they've come to China to learn how China has developed as a nation so that they can bring it back to their home nations and implement similar policies. So here I've found that students have pretty much internalized these narratives, and that folks who are deciding to work on quote-unquote African development are kind of doing so either directly from the vantage point or from, like, a perspective that's very much aligned with the Chinese state's perspective on development. So this is one of my favorite quotes that somebody said, who is a student at the China Agricultural University. So they are a leader in the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. There are, like, 80 plus political parties in Ethiopia, but this is, like, the communist one, quote, quote, and has a position, like, managing, like, an agricultural province, basically, in Ethiopia. And he said, Ethiopians engage in politics. There's nothing to it. You need food first. So a very classic kind of example of, like, we need to, like, focus on feeding people. We need to focus on the economic side. Like, we cannot focus on these, like, democracy ideals that the West is like pushing on us. And then this other person kind of seeing, like, not denying that China is a neocolonial power, but also seeing like how they can benefit from the neocolonialism that China is offering. So this person like literally said, if I'm being colonized, at least I'm benefiting. So she's like, I am fully scheming my way here, like using this scholarship. Like I fully understand what's going on, and yet like my life is improving like as a result of this. Okay, third thing, this was kind of like, for me, a very interesting topic. Yeah, question. Yeah, so I think there's a few different approaches. Like some of these students, a lot of them are entering like specialized programs that are targeted towards espousing Chinese perspectives on certain issues. So they spend their first year like learning Mandarin, and then they take like politics classes. Like this agricultural university is like specifically for like global South government leaders to come and like learn. Like they take them on field trips to farms and be like, here's a model that we did, like how can you put it in your country? Like very, very direct. But then there's also the like people who just enter like programs that are pre-existing, like the Schwartzman program, like the MA in international politics. Like there's people from all over the world there. So I don't know if that would be that different from doing an MA in international politics somewhere else. There are definitely certain things that professors like won't say in criticism of the Chinese state when you're in China, because the situation is very politically sensitive. But in terms of like I don't know, like they probably learn like similar like IR theories and stuff like that. Yeah, Reem. Yes, they're all on scholarships. Yeah, and there are like specific scholarships set aside for African students that have grown over the years, and that's why people have been going. Yeah. Mhm. No, it was just whoever responded to my call, I interviewed them because I didn't have that much time to specify. But as I was saying a little bit earlier, like the most people that I interviewed were from East Africa, with some subset from like various other places as well. Yeah, Bryce. Yes, and also like intentionally so. And this thing about political non-interference is very interesting because, for example, like African nations that support Taiwan in the United Nations like do not get these scholarships. So it's very like targeted towards like potential like friends of China or like allies of China. Yeah. All good? Okay, so the third part here is kind of more a reflection of Beijing as a globalized city and becoming this hub of education, culture, and opportunity. And to be honest, when I read this now, I feel a little sad because this is like very much not the case anymore, because they kicked everyone out in the last like 3 or 4 years during COVID. So pretty sad, but at this time, like there was this very bustling kind of network of Pan-African communities in Beijing where people were expressing to me, like, I've actually never met someone from Kenya or from Ethiopia until I came to China, like this person who was like, you know, from Tanzania, like a neighboring country or something like that, and they probably like bonded over like shared othering experiences and racism, quite frankly, that they experienced in China, but kind of like in an unintended way. Like a couple of quotes here that I think are really powerful. I came to China to discover Africa, and China is the capital city of Africa. Like those are impressions that like people are having based on the communities that they've been able to find among this like class of African students in China, which is kind of like an unintentional consequence of the soft power strategy, where people are associating their experience in China with this kind of like vibrant Pan-African community energy that they'll probably like think back on fondly. And at the same time, like this mini kind of whatever melting pot space is very isolated from the rest of the city and is like completely not integrated. And folks face like unique barriers due to racism, especially because Chinese people are like notoriously anti-Black. And with broader society, there was already like not very hopeful signs, and there was also no way really for folks to like stay long term. Like that was never the goal, and that's not what most people conceive of like their time there as. This has become much more dramatic since COVID. Like I had many people that I had interviewed like send me videos of like their friends getting beat up or like arrested and like really horrible things like during the pandemic, whereas previously like the things that I heard from people was more like, yeah, like people like stare at me on the bus, but I'm not gonna get shot here like I would in America. Like things like that, like straight up. And yeah, I think that like the majority of people I interviewed like no longer live there, either by choice or because of COVID restrictions and like being kind of kicked out. And nowadays even when I like went back, I wasn't able to go for 4 years. Because I don't have a Chinese passport or like a visa that they recognized during COVID, and it's like visible like how much like there are way fewer foreigners than there used to be, just in general. And this community was definitely like, I would say like, I mean I don't have statistics on it, but I would guess like disproportionately targeted because they're not only foreigners but they're also Black. Okay. Ending on a positive note, here are some of my friends that I interviewed. I found fieldwork to be super rewarding, especially like getting to see different corners of Beijing and being able to have conversations with folks. Something I found that I like really found affirming that I hope will be the case in my upcoming project, but you know, we never know. That everyone who opted into doing the interview was super interested in the project. They wanted to know the findings. A lot of them followed up to like receive like a copy of the thesis, and I've kept in touch with some of them too and like become friends with them. And this is kind of like at the time like it was like a hot topic, and so people were very willing to offer their experiences and insights. Although, I guess to Reem's point a little bit too, like, because students were on government scholarships, they were also, like, I think several people were also like, well, I would tell you what I really think, but I'm on a government scholarship, so I'm just gonna, you know, say positive things about the state. Some conclusions. So I think that for a project like this, the ethnographic approach was pretty essential to actually get a glimpse of the lives of African students and alumni in Beijing. I couldn't imagine like somebody trying to do this project if they didn't have WeChat or didn't have like any access into these communities. It's kind of like China in general as a society, Beijing as a city, and the like even the international community is like a pretty insular, like in-groupy kind of feeling. So it felt like very special that I was afforded access to these spaces. Also, like this was my first time kind of doing a self-driven research project, and I was able to kind of find my feet as a researcher and like understand what I care about, which is like mainly like talking to people and trying to make sense of what they say. There's like this research cluster started by this professor at Georgetown called Chinese in Africa, Africans in China, which is specifically about like the migration patterns between China and the African continent. There's way more studies on Chinese in Africa compared to Africans in China. And it was just a really cool way for me to rediscover a city that I grew up in and to see kind of different cleavages in it. Also lots of limitations, very, very short fieldwork period, barely able to scratch the surface. A lot has changed since COVID. And I think like to some people ask like, if I chose country focuses, I think that would have been really rich, is to like go deeper into like China's specific relationship with one or a few different nations and kind of situate that and talk to people just from there. And also to go beyond Beijing. So some of the other like big hubs where African communities are, for example, in Guangzhou, there's a big trading community that's like a port city in the south, and a few others as well. So a couple of remaining questions. What are the long-term effects of Chinese quote-unquote investment in African students? how will these students, who many of whom are presumably now in government positions or are professors, like back in their home countries, how have they translated their viewpoints, and like what do they think now? And some of the organizations that they started, like did they all just kind of fade away with the lack of funding after COVID? Will they create ripple effects? And also how, this group of people, like it's a growing group, and if it were to resume growing at some point, like how could they, as a, the voices of like folks who actually like lived in China and studied in China, who do have unique perspectives on what it's like to live in China and study in China, like how will they change or shape global public opinion about China as a state and as a rising superpower? So some of the things that I would be curious about, although like I said, it would be pretty impossible to do a project like this now, which is why I've like completely pivoted my work due to many constraints. But nevertheless, very fruitful project. Sadly feeling a little hopeless about where China is at these days. So it's nice to be able to share with you kind of a more optimistic period. Thank you.